Hi. So we are having another conversation with on Cyber GPT Pulse podcast here. After some time, we have been discussing a lot of on end points, which like AI and supply chain software security has been center of stage due to various attacks here and there, and but we thought that there might be very good useful case that where we can cover some background of how we can entertain threat intelligence or dark web monitoring, these kind of topics. And I was talking to one of the guys from Hack Notice, that's Connor, Jim Connor, and Jim does have some understanding on that. So I would love to have him on board. He's a lead solution engineer at Hack Notice, specialized in SaaS-based application. Has also collaborated with many of the Fortune 100 enterprise. Has been also working in cybersecurity sector from a long period of time. And so, yeah, I will hand over the stage to Connor to introduce himself in his word.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really excited to be here and speak to threat intelligence in reference to particularly dark web and supply chain threat intelligence. To your point, I'm a lead solutions engineer over at Hack Notice today, and my main focus is helping organizations combat these threats exactly. So, been through a lot of real world examples when it comes to supply chain breaches, how that impacts organizations, dark web exposures, threat actor communications on the dark web that can impact organizations. So, very excited to dive deeper into that with you both today.
Yeah, so that sounds great. And we have been talking about supply chain software security in various of our podcast, and certainly I think you can add to specific context that is threat intelligence here.
Well, Connor, as you mentioned, like you are more optimized on more SaaS-based applications throughout your career, and which has diverse industries and company size as well. So, why don't you give an audience a overview, like when we talk about supply chain intelligence? So, what are we really trying to protect? So, why should every organization, not just the big players, care about what's happening in the dark web? So, if you can shed some light based on that, like scenarios or for supply chain, that would help.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a clarification. So I've worked with companies across all sizes and all industries almost. So from SMB to Fortune 5, supply chain is an issue, right? So first off, when I think about supply chain threat intelligence, it's like, what are we trying to protect? What's the point? And at its core, it's still the same as almost any other cybersecurity effort, right? Protecting our data, access to our environment, and also as a byproduct, protecting our company's reputation, right? If we get caught up in the news because of a data leak, that doesn't help anyone across the organization. So right? What we're thinking about with supply chain is protecting against indirect compromise, right? So I could have the best defenses, the best infrastructure, MFA across the board, right? Every single piece of my internal infrastructure could be rock solid, but a simple breach into a vendor, someone in my supply chain, someone I'm sharing data with, even a contractor, as we saw in I believe it was 2013 Target breach, very old one, but right, that can open the door. So as we track data, track ransomware attacks, and the evolution of it over time, we're seeing more and more of these threat actors work in a supply chain oriented manner, right? These are organized crime groups for the most part. They know what they're doing, and they can find the weakest point of entry, whether that's internally at an organization or it's through a supply chain partner first. And so, again, going back to your question, why should we care about what's happening on the dark happening in supply chain threat intelligence? Um, One, when it comes to what's happening on the dark web in relation to supply chain, dark web can be a great indicator for early detection, right? So going back to a vendor potentially being the initial access point or a way that a threat actor gains access to an organization. The sooner I know about my supply chain partner having that compromise, the faster I can respond. And the dark web is a great place to get early indicators, whether that's through threat actor chatter, whether that's through a ransomware gang claiming the victim on their dark web onion site or their leak site, as some people call it. And so staying ahead of the game, staying ahead of the public disclosure of the events, cutting off access sooner, removing any kind of accounts that may be created for a particular data partner, contractor, et cetera, which I can dive deeper into. But those are great ways to utilize the dark web to stay ahead of supply chain threat intelligence. And finally, my last point here to your question is, why should every organization care about this, right? Not just large enterprises as we might think about when we think about big data breaches, because that's what kind of hits the news. When we look at trends, again, going back to annual breach reports, real time reports of what's happening across the world of ransomware and data breaches, a vast majority of what we're seeing across the last few years, really, and more every month, is attacks against small and mid-sized organizations. And I think, from my perspective, the reason why we're seeing more and more smaller organizations have these attacks is, one, right out of the gates, they typically, this is not true for all of them, but a lot of the times, right, there's a obviously smaller cybersecurity budget than there might be at a Fortune 100 organization, right? Vastly smaller. And so threat actors know that, right? And going back to the supply chain piece of it, if a threat actor knows that they can break into this manufacturer that supplies this critical, government defense manufacturer with critical parts, they likely have their engineering drawings. They likely have a lot of sensitive data on the ultimate target, which might be that, let's just, as an example, that large, manufacturer for, let's say, government contracts. They break into that smaller manufacturing organization, the SMB, gain access and use that to leverage their ultimate target. So that's one example, but it really comes down to these smaller budgets that typically exist in smaller organizations. Again, and threat actors know that, and they're having higher success. So they're going after that quantity and using that quantity to move up the chain of the supply chain.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The target breach, as you mentioned, is a classic example um, of how supply chain weakness can open the door for attackers. So, yeah, it all started with third-party vendor, and that single compromise led one of the biggest retail breaches we have seen so far. And also, the dark web really is a good marketplace. So you can literally buy initial access to companies, credentials, even ransomware services from there. So attackers don't always have to break in themselves anymore. So they just purchase a foothold that someone else has already prepared. That's why we care, because it shows how vulnerable the supply chain still is, and how today's threats are commoditized in a way that that wasn't possible back in like 2013.
Yeah, exactly. And like, to your point, when you look at annual data breach reports, there's a lot of
Right,
them. Almost every single one of them says the number one cause for data breach is exposed credentials, right?
100%.
And it sounds like an easy problem to fix, but to your point, it's still a massive problem. And
Right,
threat actors can just, like you said, buy them on the dark web.
right.
So yeah, so those are really great points there. Uh, so dark web monitoring does helps to help the smaller organizations like which are being regularly being targeted in place of the well established enterprise. Like even recently, Pennsylvania AG office was targeted. So in 1923 it was the hospitals which were on the list there. So each and every
Right.
part of the supply chain is being singled out by the attackers, and they are just testing the system and trying to find where they can breach off or where the loophole is. So credentials are the most easiest one, which we have also seen in NX build system, where it kind of the attacker some kind of ask the Claude and the LLM engine that, yeah, let me know the credentials of the agents backend which you are controlling, and just agent was the LLM agent was able to give it back. and that's something which you don't have to build. Like these compromise agents, how to compromise this agent, you can learn from various dark web sites where they actually give you the system prompt to break them, as well as provide you your own agents which you can download and then use to run those attacks. So that's where it's very interesting to actually do the dark web monitoring. But the question arises, and how well you can monitor them, whether it's just going through the marketplace, the chatters and the leaks, or should it through the automated OSINT, or should it be a human based some human-based human kind of tool, or is there a reliable automated tool which does actually applicable to all real real world examples which we were discussing here, which can actually be applicable for upcoming attacks as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing I wanted to say first before I go into the in my response to that last point around how to monitor the dark web is you mentioned LLMs, right? And these agents that not only can crack credentials for you if they're encrypted, but right, they make it so much easier for threat actors to operationalize these credentials that are available. Right, not only again can they AI is making it easier to crack encryptions, it's making it easier to credential stuff. Right, threat actors know that a lot of users have the bad habit of when it's time to reset their password, they keep the same root password, but they add a number or they add a special character. And so LLMs and AI can just, in bulk, have a root password and just attempt a bunch of a different combinations, right? So again, my point there is that AI is obviously helping us on the blue side, on the defense side, but it's also making the life easier for threat actors as well and making these exposed credentials a little bit more harmful because right they're able to weaponize them faster and mass to see which ones do get them authenticated. So wanted to say that real quick. But in terms of how can we actually monitor the dark web, there's a lot that goes into it, right? There's these days the dark web in my mind is not even the right term for it. You know, you have dark web forums, which kind of the traditional dark web you would monitor. You have Telegram channels where threat actors are sharing this kind of information. You have Discord, you have WeChat, you have all these kind of social platforms. There's so many different places that need to be monitored, right? And there's a lot of tools out there that will provide dark web monitoring, but that can mean a few different things. It can mean, hey, we're monitoring what threat actors are saying, which we'll call chatter, right? What are they saying back and forth? What threat actors are talking about doing what? Then you have the actual files that are being sold and trafficked, which, right, a CSV, a TXT with millions of credentials that are derived from phishing attacks, info stealer malware, etc. So there's a lot that goes into staying on top of all of that, monitoring it and alerting to what actually matters. But to get to the root of your question, there's there are ways you can have some automation but there's always going to need, at least in my mind, for the near term, there's always going to need to be some kind of human element for it, right? So Hack Notice collects data from the dark web and alerts to it. There's a lot of other services out there that offer a similar service. But in terms of if I don't have a service that's monitoring this for me, what does it look like to manually go out there and monitor? And I think that might help add some context. So, first thing is getting into the right places, right? Being able to know which hacker forums on the dark web share this kind of information, getting an account, getting into those forums, being able to know where to look on Telegram to find the channels that are sharing this kind of data. Same with Discord and other socials. And that part, in my opinion, at least in the near term, is always going to need to have some sort of human aspect to it. There's going to need to be someone who is constantly hunting, looking for these new channels that pop up, constantly getting into those channels and creating personas that make hacker breathing sounds so that hackers don't think you're there just to collect data to defend against them. But then there's the automated piece where once you're in those forums and those channels, knowing how to build a data collector or a scraper that is automated that will collect everything that's published and then, right, in some way, shape, or form, index that and make it digestible. So for a small to medium sized company, right, that's a lot of work. And again, there's a lot of services out there that provide the ability to automatically alert these organizations when records of interest arise on the dark web, like passwords, social security numbers, even, or if a threat actor is talking about them directly. Um, so I'm happy to share like some examples of things that have been found on the dark web that have been early indicators of these kinds of breaches. But first, just wanted to, in a long-winded way, talk about a little bit into how you can actually collect that data.
Yeah, so I think you hit the right points there, specifically to sum up for our audience, specifically to detect and alert the initial forums or groups of Telegram, which is actually talking about the organizational detail or credentials or maybe some kind of tool which directly impact the organization in some kind of business. That's where we require a automation tool, because we cannot rely on a human to go into these millions of different platforms to actually check them. And then the second phase comes around. Based on the alerts, you have to have the human in loop to have the investigation going on, that whether these alerts does triage in the right direction and impact the organization. So that's where it's get really interesting. In one of my own incident, we had something related where we were tagged around from our Intel platform, that one of the Telegram group was using a crack version of one of our tool, and that was not exactly a PII issue, but it was much more exactly losing money on that. And we have to track down those number of tools, because the group which were initially alerted, that was closed down, and there was multiple dangling link going on after attacker kind of came to know that he had been flagged by the intelligent platform. So he kind of trained and hide his track and send the multiple copies to multiple different groups. But we have to follow them up. But yeah, the initial detection was done by these automated tools. So that part I agree. Yeah, if you like to share your own detailed experience, yeah, I think I would. I know audience will love to hear that.
Yeah, yeah, and with dark web monitoring, whether it's forum, marketplaces, leaks, or even just a chatter, the idea is to catch, those little breadcrumbs early. So, like, we have a compromised tools, like compromised credentials showing up or talk about a new exploit. But honestly, there's a ton of noise out there. So, right. So, not everything posted is legit or even useful. So, that kind of raises the next question. So, how do you filter out all that noise and get to the stuff that's actually actionable? And do you think AI or machine learning can really help with that in the context of supply chain threats? Or is it still more of a human game at the end of the day?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And let me start by trying to paint the picture of the flow chart that I see as of where it is today. So, kind of like we just talked about, I think, regardless, let's just assume in this situation that I'm a large enterprise. I'm trying to build out my entire dark web monitoring platform in house. So there's always going to need to be some human intelligence, some human analyst work at the very beginning to identify the correct channels, forums, et cetera, that I need to infiltrate to collect this data from. Now we have, assuming we've done that, a large breadth of data from threat actors' communications to credentials to PII that's being shared in files, right? There's an overload of information across all these sources. And the collection of that, once the initial infiltration is done by a human, setting up an automated collector, we can then collect all of that breadth of information in an automated fashion. Now we have all this information. Now I need to figure out what might be relevant to me. That's where I think AI can be great, right? So we might tell AI some domains, some critical strings, usernames, email, anything that we're looking for to have been mentioned in this breadth of data across the dark web, silo that out. And then now we have some data, again, that's an automated step. Now we have this data that might be relevant to my organization. And there are some automated ways we can tailor that better. So let's just go back to like dark web monitoring, right? If you are signed up for a service that does those first two steps for you, that is looking at collection and alerting, and maybe you load in your domain, and now I'm receiving any exposed credentials that are associated with my domain. I guarantee you about 60, maybe up to 90% of those are going to be associated to old users, inactive accounts, fake data. So now you have to clean that up somehow. So there's some automated ways you can clean that up by, filtering by active users. You could do some kind of integration with an SIEM that could automatically compare to your Active Directory to see if the credentials are valid. There's a lot of steps you could do there. But then comes the next piece, which, in my opinion, so the next piece being response, right? So I do get an alert, I do see something that is relevant or potentially relevant, and I do want to investigate. I think there are some new agentic AI tools that are coming out that can make that easier for humans, maybe to get past that part of this, take those, this might be relevant, to use agentic AI to say this is relevant. But I still think, again, near term, that final step is going to need some human intelligence, at least for the next few years, unless we see some major leaps and bounds. But that piece of responding, of taking action, agentic AI could take some action, but taking action in the sense of further investigations, again, back to human. So I see it as human, automated, and then human, and as at the end of the day. And so, with that said, there's tying it back to kind of the supply chain. So, when I think of the dark web, I kind of see two streams in my head. One is the actual raw data that's being shared, credentials, PII, financial data, crypto data, right? Those are in files typically, and they're for sale, being trafficked. Then you have the chatter, where there's threat actors, ransomware gangs, etc., making claims, saying things, whatever it might be. There's a large variety of chatter. A lot of the chatter, you don't always know if it's true or not. The data is data. Some of it might be made up, some of it might be old, but it is factually some sort of data in a file. So going back to my previous point, I think especially with the chatter, there's always going to need to be at least a little bit of human intelligence. So I'm familiar with the workflow from what I do, where we are monitoring for any confirmed data breaches to any company globally. So there's a lot of government disclosures. There's a lot of news articles. Those are pretty straightforward. But then you have this concept of the chatter, going back to that. So millions of posts across dark web forums, every quarter probably. And then using an AI to look at every single post that we bring in and say, is there a chance this could be a data breach based on what's said, based on any available sample files that we see? Is there a chance that this could be a data breach? And then if yes, that's the end of the road for AI there. And a human analyst is going to review, take a look, and then confirm if that's a breach. An example of this is from March of this year. I'm not going to name a company name, but a very, 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 very large tech company had two back-to-back data breaches. The first one, they denied for a while, then finally admitted to it in the April timeframe. So they admitted to it mid to late April. Early mid-March, a threat actor posted on breach forums, which is constantly being, I think right now it's still down, but regardless, that they had broken into this company and had stolen 6 million password key files for their customers and posted sample files. And so if you're looking at that kind of information and you're seeing this, and you either have the tools or you have the internal capability to have reviewed those sample files, verified the data, looked at the threat actor that posted it, saw that they've also posted reputable claims, you would have early indication that this large company that you're probably a customer of or are a customer of, could have your password key file compromised. If you use dark web signals like that are verified, you would have about a 6 weeks heads up to know that your password key files to a critical business application are compromised. So that's a great example from earlier this year of using a dark web signal to detect a supply chain incident. But again, it has to go through that whole flow chart first to even become actionable. And so that's the hard part, is taking all this information, using a mix of human and AI to get it to the point where you can receive an alert, receive a notification that your supply chain vendor has had a critical compromise. In this case, 6 weeks ahead of public disclosure.
Yeah, so I think the interesting part which you discussed there about the company having that disclosure, I think many of the audience who are working in this area might have already guessed that company because it's been in the news multiple time in those days. And yeah, so we can leave that there. But yeah, it was interesting, these kind of, so the categorization which you made is, we have data and then we have the semantic chatters which kind of need to be used for correlation. Like data can be used for predictive analytics, but the chatters need to be used for correlating these likely data breaches are actually applicable or exploitable, or is actually what the can also be used for initially identifying whether a possible plan of compromise or attack is there. So which puts upon my next idea of question is like, can we do that, like correlating these chatters and other information from these various forums to predict next attack, like some executable backdoor attacks, which where we know that the attackers just kind of using the SSH public key, and it was recognized by the engineer that yeah, this public key was going very slow. So it was not by any other detection mechanism, it was just an engineer who kind of found out that the SSH authentication was going slow. That was the main point where the backdoor was detected. But is there a possibility that where we can just go ahead and these chatters might lead into finding about some attacker who is planning to having similar backdoor creation and trying to find out the details about that? Okay, is there a available agent or available code base which I can use to compromise SSH vulnerability based on the IOCs which the potential attacker is creating through the chatters? Is there a way to address those and correlate and then flag that this might be a potential plan of action or plan of action for attack?
Yeah, I love this topic, or this point of the conversation, because I think, yes, in short, I think there are ways of doing it. I think there are people and companies out there now doing it to some capacity. But when you look at, you know, there's a lot of factors, and it's very, very difficult to correlate all those factors together. So let's start just by looking at threat actor dark web chatter on the dark web. So looking at that, we can pretty easily determine if a threat actor is making a claim that they've broken into a company or exfiltrated data, right? They'll have a sample file, there'll be a reputable threat actor, it could be coming directly from a ransomware gang. Okay, we know that this compromise has happened. Cool, we got it. But when we start talking about the predictive side, where we're trying to get signals before that compromise, before that exfiltration has happened, that's where we run into even more noise, right? There's so many threat actors on a daily basis that are saying, hey, I'm going to do this to this company with this, and nothing happens. So there's a lot of false claims, or, um, maybe they are planning to do it, they just fail. But regardless, so there's the piece of looking at the chatter. So you can look at it holistically, and you can say, hey, there's a lot of threat actors across a lot of forums talking about this CVE that NVD released yesterday, or there's a lot of threat actors talking about this organization. And then that's one piece of the puzzle, right? Just because there's so much uncertainty when it comes to chatter. But then you also have other factors like, again, CVEs being announced. Does that correlate with the chatter, kind of like in the example I just mentioned? Are we seeing an increase of access brokers selling data to certain companies? And is there a correlation with that? And again, recent CVEs or with recent chatter on the dark web? And then you have to bring in factors, I think, that are important, like recent trends. So has there been an increase of data breaches to certain industries, and why is that happening? Does that correlate with what we're seeing being spoken about on the dark web? So there is, I think, in my head, there is a way to take all of that. So like heat maps of geographical and industry attacks, CVEs, 0 days. You have access brokers, then you have chatter. I do think if you encapsulated all of that in a very clean way and started looking at trends, we could get more predictive around what is going to happen. And then obviously kind of we might also on an easier level. So that's kind of like big picture, the way I see it could be in an ideal world. Bringing it down, in short, there absolutely are threat actors out there who are explicitly saying what they're going to do before they do it, or giving indicators of what they're going to do before they do it, and that can be used in a predictive manner. The hard part is identifying what's false and what's true, because about 97% of it's probably false. And we don't want to spin everyone's wheels in incident response 97% of the time when it's not even, it just doesn't need to be done, right? There's already so much of a limited resource, and response and human analyst time in the cybersecurity industry. So that's the big problem with using dark web chatter in a predictive way. That's why I started by saying I think there is a way to correlate all that data using AI and be more accurately predictive on what analysts should look into from a predictive standpoint. But that's how I kind of see the world in that case, right? There's a lot of factors. Now, one thing that I think can be done near term that we have been seeing a lot of strong signals out of is, and this is kind of simplifying that ideal world picture I painted a minute ago. We look at trends by industry and by geography over different time periods. And like, so for example, right now, month over month, there's a surprising 250% increase in ransomware attacks against oil and gas transportation. Not commonly, it is more and more, right? We're seeing more attacks towards what we'll call critical infrastructure. Oil and gas transportation can fall into that. But that's something that might raise a flag. We also look holistically at dark web traffic. And if we see an influx of unique traffic data, so essentially a anomalous influx of, we'll say, mentions of a certain company, that will trigger a flag to look further into it. So those are kind of, I think, the first baby steps towards that big picture I painted. I'm not aware of any companies using all of that, or any organizations they might be, but using all of that in a single predictive model. But that's how I think it could be done. And I kind of gave examples of other options that are lower lifts that I think still bring some value.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Looking at CV chatter, 0 day trends, and even the predictive stuff, as you mentioned, we have a different trend that really shows where we are headed at with the threat intelligence. So we are not just reacting anymore. We are starting to anticipate the things how they're going to turn out to be. Um, what do you think, Amir?
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And so my the idea which I was bringing on, and detailed give a detailed framework for that corner, was running on from a couple of other papers and things which I have been hearing from various industry researchers, but I haven't seen it applied by any of the company. That's why I asked that if any of
Yeah.
the companies is actually trying and getting some results, because that's where the problem is, that you have the technique, you can create the framework, but the result is having a very high noise, and we cannot entail that on the incident responder to just have more noise in their workspace. So yeah,
Yep.
that's yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can continue there.
So that's exactly the point, right? And this is the issue with, I think, everything in cybersecurity. It is the noise overload, right? So yes, to your point, I think there are a lot of companies out there that have all of this data that we're talking about, trends and breaches, CVE data, recent exploits, dark web chatter, dark web traffic data. It's just finding the right way to correlate all that effectively. I think with AI in our hands now, I think someone will get there soon. Um, so, for example, this is how I could see it, right? I just mentioned a minute ago that there's a 250% increase in oil and gas transportation ransomware attacks month over month. And that's as of today. So, that's something to keep in mind. So there's a large influx of ransomware attacks against this industry. And if I drill down into that, I can actually see about a majority of that increase comes from the ransomware gang Play, or Play News is their leak site. And then I could go in and look, okay, what are Play ransomware's traditional TTPs? What are they known to do to gain access? Maybe it's CVE exploitation. Okay, great. Let's take a look at all the recent CVEs. Let's see if there's any CVEs that are associated with any kind of applications, services that are tailored for the oil and gas transportation. Maybe there are a couple. Maybe there's one. Maybe there's not any. But let's assume there is one. Now let's go to dark web chatter and let's see, is there anyone out there talking about this particular CVE or talking about the service that or the application that CVE is associated with? Maybe we do see some reputable threat actors talking about it. Maybe we see some. Maybe we see Play ransomware talking about it. Then we are really kind of getting onto something, and then we can start correlating that with again other recent trends, companies that might be confirmed within the supply chain of the application that's tied to the CVE, right? So there's so much kind of funneling. I think that's a simplified example, but I think that is how it could be done. So wanted to kind of refine my thoughts there a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good thought to actually uh, not just refine the OSINT data which you are collecting through various open source intel as well as monitoring the sites, but correlating that to the semantic analysis and kind of overall sentiment analysis of various chatters to then find out the impact of it via TTP. Like based on the TTP, we can identify the potential threat actor if it is already in our database. It's not a nation threat or a new attacker which is not available in the threat actor list. But if there is, then we can correlate to that, and then the impact can be prioritize based on that, and based on that we can also prioritize the noise which we were talking about initially. Maybe there might be some better useful result which can be finally at least used by the incident responder.
Yeah, as Connor mentioned, industries like oil and gas, they are at huge risk. Like I mean, like a single compromised vendor or a tainted software update, everything is misconfigured. So industrial control system can have a like massive ripple effects. So we have to think operational downtime wise, safety risk standpoint, and even energy supply disruptions that need to be aware of. So that's why the sector um, really needs proactive monitoring and then threat intelligence instead of making it more reactive. So, and then as you mentioned, dark web piece is another important thing. It's wild to see all the forums, marketplaces, and we do have leak credentials and chatterbot exploits, almost like an entire underground economy running in parallel to this. So now that there's another layer that's getting added to it, like AI powered attacks into the mix. So everything just moves faster and faster. So really combining OSINT or any other automated tools and knowing what's real versus just noise, so it's more important than ever. So especially for sectors like oil and gas, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and to add to that, the OT sector like Schneider and oil and gas specifically are drill downing on AI automated tools to which was not the case in last 5 years or 10 years because they were not. into cloud that much, but the cloud-based space and cloud space threat actor and threats were even not useful for the whole infrastructure there, but now as they are looking for better results from LLM and agentic AI, it will be they will be having the similar threats which the other enterprises are already facing. And the problem is that this security resources, like there are not enough OTs, cybersecurity professionals, so they cannot even find, if even if they find money, they cannot hire enough persons there. So that's where we require the automated security tools for monitoring to actually simplify the data which they are getting. And that's the only way which we can help the industry to move forward.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll add to that just a little bit, right? So oil and gas, great example. Manufacturing is another great example of industries that, as you mentioned, historically don't live much in the cloud. Historically, don't have much in terms of security teams, right? In the past 3, 4, 5 years ago, let's say, I have spoken to quite a few very large companies in those spaces, 20, 50,000 employees plus, that might only have one or two cybersecurity designated individuals. That's a lot to handle. And to your point, though, I was at Black Hat and DEF CON this year. I got to speak to a lot of people across every industry, but sounds like, to your point, a lot of these, we'll say the industries that traditionally might not have as much cybersecurity investment as others are lifting it up there. More investments in AI, automation, et cetera, which is exciting to see, especially because critical infrastructure is, as a whole, we're seeing there's always been a lot of attacks against it from a cyber perspective, but it's going up more and more. Regardless if it's nation state activity or ransomware for money activity, they know they have. Let's use the ransomware getting attacked for money as an example. They know they have a lot of leverage, right? Because if you're locking out a critical infrastructure company, there's probably a lot of pressure on them to get things back up and running, as a simplified example. So those are industries that I'm excited to see a lot more development and their resources in AI for cyber defense, because I think that that trend is only going to continue to increase of attacks in their industry.
Yeah, and I can throw the weight in that space because I come from that space and working in the similar company. It's not just because we want to do these securitization of our current system, but there are many regulations which are in place because of which you have to do that, even if you are not working in IT space. So yeah.
Yeah. uh, and like unfortunately, majority of the companies don't go by regulations and governance and compliance, which is why they land up with a lot of security complications and a lot of attack vectors going their way. It's sad, but it is what it is. Well, then that's a wrap. So huge thanks to Connor for sharing such sharp insights on supply chain security, oil and gas, and the dark web. Conversations like this really make you appreciate how complex cybersecurity has become and why being proactive is critical.
Yeah, and I think I could talk for another 3 hours plus about this. So it's definitely a complex
Interesting.
subject. There's a lot going on. Yeah,
Yeah.
but really appreciate y'all inviting me, and it was great to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really a web of conversation as we speak about. So we have to just start giving some understanding to the audience. And I would love to have some white papers and anything which you want to share. We can add them in our show note for any of our audience want to look into in details.
Absolutely, happy to share that with you.
Anything, any particular message you want to share to our listeners across?
I'll give one quick one-liner to wrap up on. If you're in the cybersecurity space, and we've been talking a lot about third party, so I'll leave it to that. So if you're looking at your vendors, I wouldn't think about who is going to get breached or if one of them will get breached. I would think what 10 to 15% of my supply chain vendors will have a ransomware attack or breach this year, and how would I respond to that? I think we haven't talked about this at all, but having that playbook of response is critical because these attacks are happening, and there's a very, very high chance that annually you will have a supplier or a vendor that has an incident. So that was more than a one liner, but I would keep that in mind.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yep. So yeah,
All right.
thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Connor.
Yep. Thanks, Connor. And yeah, let's wrap up our today's podcast. Thanks, listener, to having the patience for a longer version of this podcast episode. And we, we appreciate if you give a like and subscribe for this channel. And if you want to connect with Connor, I will be adding his information in the show note. And see you in the next episode. Thank you.